When the tide is high, there is no way to reach Castle Stalker without a boat. The small rocky islet in Loch Laich, the inlet off Loch Laich near Port Appin in Argyll, is completely cut off from the mainland, and the four-story tower house that rises from it, its dark silhouette against the Morvern Hills, its reflection broken by the chop of the loch, can only be watched from shore. This has always been both the castle's greatest strength and the quality that most defines its character. It is a fortress that the world cannot reach unless you choose to let it. From the shore road between Oban and Glencoe, at the point where the road swings close to the water, the view appears with almost theatrical abruptness. One moment you are driving through the ordinary landscape of the West Highland coast. The next, the tower is simply there, sitting in the middle of the water as if it has always been there. Which in fact it more or less has. Painters have been coming to this spot for centuries. Photographers come now. On a clear morning, with the light right and the hills of Morvern purple across the water, Castle Stalker looks precisely like what it is, a medieval tower house standing in a sea loch in Argyll, built by a family that needed the water as a wall because the land had too many enemies on it. The castle's Gaelic name is Castile and Stalker, the castle of the hunter, or the falconer. The name came from the king who used it as a hunting lodge, James IV of Scotland, who came to Appin for the game-rich forests, and who apparently came often enough that the castle's identity was permanently shaped by his visits. But the hunting king is only one layer of the castle's history, and probably not the darkest. The darker layers include the MacDougalls, who built the first fortification on this rock, and then backed the wrong side in the Wars of Scottish Independence, the murder of Sir John Stewart outside Dunstaffnage Castle in 1463, the Battle of Stalk fought within sight of the islet, the murder of Duncan Stewart in 1512 by the Macleans, the baby Donald hidden in the castle while Campbells killed his father on the adjacent island, the drunken wager of 1620 in which the 7th Stuart chief bet the castle against a boat, lost, and gained only an 8-oared wherry for his inheritance, the siege of 1689, the Jacobite rising of 1745, when 300 Stuart soldiers with 2-pound cannonballs bounced harmlessly off the walls, and the castle held against them, the Appin murder of 1752, and the Campbell jury that hanged an innocent man, the roof that came off around 1840, possibly to avoid paying a roof tax. And finally, in 1965, one lieutenant colonel and his family spending 10 years rebuilding it by hand. This is the history of a castle that the water keeps. Most of it did not happen quietly. The structure itself is modest by the standards of the great medieval castles of Scotland. No concentric walls, no great hall, no barbican or gatehouse complex. It is a 4-story tower house on a rock, practical and austere. What it has instead of architectural ambition is positional brilliance. The water does what walls would do elsewhere, and the views from the upper floors do what a network of outlying towers would do at a land-based castle. The building is perfectly adapted to its specific environment in a way that makes it, for all its simplicity, one of the most strategically intelligent castle sites in Scotland. It is also, which matters quite separately, one of the most beautiful. Beauty and strategic intelligence do not always coincide, but at Castle Stalker they have arrived at the same point from different directions. The conditions that made the islet militarily ideal also made it visually extraordinary. The water, the hills behind, the quality of the western light, the specific scale of the tower against the scale of the surrounding landscape. These are not incidental features of a site chosen for military reasons. They are the military reasons, re-experienced as aesthetics by everyone who has seen the castle since the military logic that originally chose the site became irrelevant. Chapter 1. The Rock of the Cormorants, the Land Before the Castle, Prehistory to 1200. The islet on which Castle Stalker stands is known in Gaelic as Creag and Scairb, the Rock of the Cormorants. The battle cry of Clan Stewart of Appin is Creag and Scairb. The cormorant is still there, the black seabird that stands with its wings spread to dry, as if crucified by the wind, on the rocks exposed at low tide around the castle's base. It has presumably always been there, which is to say that the islet has been a cormorant roost since before anyone thought to build anything on it. And the birds were the first to understand that a small rocky outcrop in a sheltered sea loch was a good place to be if you needed access to fish and immunity from land-based predators. The landscape that surrounds the castle is the western Highland coast in its most characteristic form. Loch Laich opens from Loch Laich, which is one of the great sea lochs of Argyll, a long, deep arm of the sea pushing north from the Firth of Lorne, penetrating deep into the Highland mass, carrying sea traffic between the Firth and the Narrows at Corran and beyond. Loch Laich was always a highway. The people who lived along its shores were people who understood sea transport, whose galleys were the primary means of communication, whose power was measured partly in the number of oars they could put on the water. The lordship of the Isles, which dominated this entire region for 2 centuries, was a maritime empire in the specific sense that its territory was defined by the sea lanes connecting the Hebrides and the western Highland coast, and power over those lanes was the fundamental expression of political authority. The islet in Loch Laich commanded the local section of these lanes. Loch Laich is a sheltered inlet from the main channel of Loch Laich, and any vessel moving up or down the Laich had to pass within sight, and within relatively easy reach, of the Cormorant's Rock. Watching who passed on the water was what a coastal strongpoint was for. The particular combination of accessibility from the sea and difficulty of access from the land that Castle Stalker's position offers was exactly the combination that West Highland warfare required. You needed to be reachable by your own galleys and unreachable by your enemy's land forces, and the tidal islet in the sheltered inlet gave you both. Before any structure was built on the Cormorant's Rock, the people who lived in Appin and in the wider district of Lorne were the descendants of the Gaelic-speaking communities that had dominated the Western Highlands since the Dalriata kingdom of the early medieval period. The lordship of Lorne, the political territory immediately relevant to the Castle Stalker site, was held by the MacDougalls, a family descended from Dougal, son of Somerled, the half-Norse, half-Gaelic king who had built a maritime empire on the western coast in the 12th century. The MacDougalls took their name and their legitimacy from Dougal, and their territory from the lands that Somerled had held, and that the collapse of Norse power after the Battle of Largs in 1263 had definitively confirmed as Scottish rather than Norse. This was the world into which the first fortification on the Cormorant's Rock was born. Chapter 2. The MacDougalls of Lorne and the Wrong Side of History, 1200 to 1388. The MacDougalls of Lorne were, in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, one of the most powerful families in western Scotland. Their heartland centered on Dunstaffnage Castle near Oban, from which they controlled the sea lanes of the Firth of Lorne and Loch Laich. They were allies of the Commons, the great northern family that was the dominant force in late 13th century Scottish politics, and through the Commons they were connected to the Balliol faction in the succession crisis that followed the death of Margaret, the Maid of Norway, in 1290. The succession crisis that produced the wars of Scottish independence had a specifically personal dimension for the MacDougalls. When Edward I of England chose John Balliol as king in 1292, the MacDougalls backed the Balliol cause and, through it, the English crown's claim to suzerainty over Scotland. When Robert Bruce murdered John Comyn in the Grey Friars Church at Dumfries in 1306 and set himself on the path to the Scottish kingship, The MacDougalls were among his most determined opponents. They were kinsmen of the Commons, they were allies of the English, and they had very specific territorial interests in ensuring that Bruce did not become king of a Scotland that could then demand their loyalty. In 1306, at the Battle of Dalry, a rocky pass above Tindrum, not far from the eastern edge of the MacDougall heartland, John of Lorne's forces ambushed Bruce's small army as it attempted to move westward. The ambush was successful. Bruce's force was scattered, and in the fighting one of the MacDougall men seized Bruce's brooch from his cloak as he fled. That brooch, the brooch of Lorne, is still in the MacDougall family collection at Dunollie Castle today. The MacDougalls had Bruce's cloak pin as a trophy of the occasion on which they almost ended his career. The original fortification at the Castle Stalker site dates from around 1320, built, in the most likely reading of the evidence, by the MacDougalls as a watchpoint and small fortalice controlling the sea lanes of Loch Laich. By that date, however, the MacDougalls' period of supremacy in Lorne was already over. The Battle of the Pass of Brander in the summer of 1308 had ended it permanently. Bruce, his position in Scotland now secure enough to take the offensive against his Highland opponents, moved into Argyll with a force that John Bacach MacDougall positioned in the narrow pass where the River Awe cuts between Ben Cruachan and the shore of Loch Awe. The plan was to use the terrain to maximum advantage. The MacDougall men were on the hillside above the pass, ready to send rocks and arrows down on Bruce's men below. But Sir James Douglas, commanding a force of loyal Highlanders, climbed higher than the MacDougalls and positioned himself behind them. When the MacDougalls attacked, Bruce's men came at them from the front and Douglas's from the rear simultaneously. John of Lorne observed the whole disaster from the safety of a galley on Loch Awe. His forces broke and fled back to Dunstaffnage. He escaped down the loch in his galley. Bruce besieged Dunstaffnage and took it. John of Lorne fled to England. His father Alexander, too old and ill to fight, submitted briefly and then also went into exile, dying in English service in 1310. The MacDougall lands in Lorne were forfeited. The family that had built the first fortification on the Cormorant's Rock had been politically destroyed by the king, who would go on to win at Bannockburn and secure Scottish independence. The MacDougalls eventually recovered some of their lands. In 1328, after Bannockburn and the Treaty of Edinburgh, there was a partial restoration, but the lordship of Lorne itself did not return to them in its original form. Instead, it passed through marriage in 1388 to the Stewarts. Walter Stewart of Bute married the MacDougall heiress Isabella, and through this marriage the lordship of Lorne, the lands of Appin, and the small fortification on the Cormorant's Rock all came to the Stewart family that would make the site what it is today. The specific detail of John of Lorne watching the Battle of the Pass of Brander from the safety of a galley on Loch Awe is one of the more vivid images in the wars of Scottish independence. He was ill. A letter he wrote to Edward II claimed he was recovering from an illness when the battle was fought, and he commanded his forces from the water, while Bruce's men and the Black Douglas closed the trap on his hillside army. The galley that carried him away from the disaster, down the loch, and eventually to England, was the same instrument of West Highland military power that the fortification at Castle Stalker was designed to serve. The fast, maneuverable vessel that could put a commander in a position of oversight, while keeping him beyond the reach of land-based attack. There is also the matter of Bruce's brooch. The brooch of Lorne, seized from Bruce's cloak during the Battle of Dalry in 1306, when John MacDougall's men ambushed the future king and came close to ending his career entirely, is still in the MacDougall family collection at Dunollie Castle in Oban today. It is a penannular brooch of silver and crystal, the kind of object that a king would wear on a formal occasion, and its survival in the possession of the family that seized it over 700 years ago is one of the stranger continuities in Scottish history. The MacDougalls backed the wrong side. were destroyed by the man whose brooch they had taken, and eventually recovered enough to maintain the family seat at Dunolly, and the brooch was with them through all of it. The fortification that the MacDougalls built on the Cormorant's Rock around 1320 was almost certainly built with the specific consciousness that the Lorne lands were politically contested and militarily vulnerable. The defeat at the Pass of Brander in 1308 and the subsequent exile had been traumatic. The recovery of some lands by 1328 was partial and conditional. The fortalice on the tidal islet was an insurance policy, a strong point that could be defended against land-based attack, supplied by sea, and held even if the political situation on the mainland continued to be difficult. The MacDougalls built it because they needed it. The Stewarts, who inherited it through marriage in 1388, inherited both the strong point and the necessity that had produced it. Chapter 3. The Stewarts of Appin build their tower, 1388 to 1463. The Stewarts, who acquired the lordship of Lorne in 1388, were a branch of the royal Stewart family, descended, like all the Stewarts, from the hereditary stewards of Scotland, who had served the Scottish kings since the 12th century, and who had become the royal house itself when Robert Stewart, grandson of Robert the Bruce, became King Robert II in 1371. The Stewarts of Appin were thus cousins of the Scottish kings, a connection that was simultaneously prestigious and politically complex, close enough to the crown to benefit from its patronage, close enough also to be drawn into its conflicts and its succession crises. Sir John Stewart was the man most directly responsible for the castle as it now stands. The present tower house was built around 1440, during the reign of James I, who had just returned from his long English captivity, and the building is associated with Sir John, who had an illegitimate son, Dugald, in 1446. The reasoning is persuasive, if not conclusive. A man who has an heir, even an illegitimate one, has a reason to build something permanent. The tower house form that Sir John built was the standard defensive architecture of the West Highland nobility in the 15th century. A tall, narrow rectangular structure of 4 stories, with the entrance at ground level, the main hall on the first floor, the Lord's private chambers above, and storage or garrison space below. The walls were thick enough to resist anything available to contemporary attackers. The location on the tidal islet meant that the water approached, which required boats which could be watched and contested, replaced the need for the curtain walls and gatehouse complex that a land-based castle of similar period would have required. Castle Stalker is, in this sense, a simplified tower house design that works precisely because its setting does the defensive work that the architecture doesn't need to. The Gaelic name Stalker, hunter or falconer, almost certainly predates the tower house. The Cormorant's Rock was used for hunting and hawking before the present building was erected, and the association of the site with the stalking of game in the hills and along the shore of Loch Laich was established enough that it gave the place its name. This hunting identity would later draw James IV to the site and shape how subsequent generations thought of it. The internal politics of the Stewart family in this period were not calm. Sir John Stewart, who had built the castle and held it as Lord of Lorne, was murdered in 1463. He was killed outside Dunstaffnage Castle by a man named Alan MacCool. The circumstances of the murder are lost to detailed documentation, but the killing of a Highland lord outside a major castle suggests treachery of a specific and personal kind, rather than the generalized violence of clan warfare. Sir John had been at the castle for legitimate purposes, and was killed as he left it. His illegitimate son Dugald, who succeeded him, was thus the first chief of Appin, a title that the Stewarts of Appin would hold for the next 3 centuries, through all the violence and political upheaval that the West Highlands generated in that time. The inheritance was tainted from the beginning. The first chief's father had been murdered. His legitimacy had been questioned. Sir John had formally married Dugald's mother at Dunstaffnage in 1463, just before his murder, specifically to legitimize the succession. And the territory he had inherited sat between the expanding power of the Campbells to the south and the turbulent MacDonald lordship to the north and west. Chapter 4. The Battle of Stalk and the First Wars with Campbell, 1463 to 1513. Dugald Stewart's first significant act as Chief of Appin was vengeance. Alan MacCool, who had murdered his father Sir John outside Dunstaffnage in 1463, was alive, and his Campbell allies were extending their pressure on the Stewart territory in Appin. In 1468, Colin Campbell and Walter Stewart, the latter recognized as Lord of Lorne but wielding no actual authority in Lorne itself, organized a massive raid against Dugald's clan, intending to destroy the power of Appin once and for all. Alan MacCool was part of this force. The two sides met at the Battle of Stalks, the site directly opposite Castle Stalker itself, on the shore of Loch Laich. The Stewarts won. Dugald himself killed Alan MacCool in the fighting. The murderer of his father died within sight of the tower that his father had built, killed by the son who had inherited both the tower and the obligation of revenge. This is exactly the kind of symmetry that makes Scottish clan history feel simultaneously authentic and novelistic. The same patch of water, the same tower, the killer and the avenger and the revenge. The killing of MacCool did not end the Campbell pressure, which was a structural feature of the political landscape of Western Scotland rather than a response to any specific grievance. The Campbells of Argyll were the dominant power in the Western Highlands, and their expansion was systematic. They used legal mechanisms, feudal superiority, marriage alliances, and, when necessary, direct military force to extend their territory and reduce the independence of neighboring clans. The Stewarts of Appin were not the only family subjected to this pressure, but their position between the Campbell heartland to the south and the larger world of MacDonald and MacLean politics to the north and west made them particularly vulnerable. The Battle of Stalk itself is worth pausing on because it is one of the more unusual episodes in the long history of the Stewart-Campbell conflict. Two sides met on the shore of Loch Laich, within sight of the castle that had been the flashpoint for the conflict. The castle whose lord had been murdered, whose constable had been the murderer, whose new heir was personally present in the battle to kill that murderer. The symmetry is almost theatrical. Dugald Stewart, first Chief of Appin, killing Alan MacCool on the shore of the loch where his father's castle stood, settling the account in view of the building that had generated the debt. The castle itself, sitting on its islet in the loch, visible from the battle site on the shore, inaccessible to the fighting unless a boat was available, was both the cause and the witness of the engagement. This relationship between the castle and the events that happen within sight of it is characteristic of Castle Stalker throughout its history. The building on the water, unreachable without deliberate effort, watching the violence happen around it. The cormorant on the rock spreads its wings. The battle is fought on the shore. The castle endures. The Campbell expansion that Dugald was fighting in 1468 was the beginning of a process that would eventually take Castle Stalker from the Stewarts altogether, first through the siege and negotiation of 1620, then through the Glorious Revolution, then definitively after the 45. Dugald's victory at Stalks was real but incomplete. He killed MacCool. He won the battle, and the Campbells continued to expand. The geography of the Western Highlands simply could not sustain independent Stewart power indefinitely against the weight of Campbell resources and political connection. Dugald Stewart was succeeded as Chief of Appin by his son Duncan after being killed in 1497, during a raid against MacDonald of Keppoch in reprisal for cattle reaving. The world of the West Highlands in this period was one in which cattle were the primary unit of wealth. Cattle raiding was an accepted, if dangerous, form of redistribution, and the proper response to having your cattle stolen was to go and get them back, or to go and get someone else's cattle in compensation. The raid that killed Dugald was not an aberration, but a typical expression of the endemic low-level violence that structured Highland economic and political life. Duncan Stewart, as chief, found himself in relationship with a king who was also a cousin. James IV of Scotland, born in 1473, was related to the Stewarts of Appin through the complex network of Stuart descent that connected the royal line to its many branches across Scotland. He came of age with an enthusiasm for the Highlands, or at least for Highland game, that expressed itself in frequent hunting trips along the western coast, and his visits to Castle Stalker were apparently numerous enough to leave a lasting impression on the building and its name. James IV used Castle Stalker as a hunting lodge, a base for the hawking and deer stalking that he pursued through the game-rich forests of Appin and the mountains above Loch Laich. The royal arms that are carved above the castle's entrance are thought to date from this period, and improvements to the building, including the addition of what is now the top floor, may have been made for royal comfort. A king who visits your castle regularly has both the means and the motive to improve it. Duncan Stewart was murdered in 1512 at Duart Castle on Mull by the Macleans. The specific circumstances of this killing are preserved in tradition, but not in documentary detail. Highland politics in the early 16th century generated murders, with a regularity that not all of them received careful contemporary documentation. Duncan was succeeded as chief by his younger brother Alan Stewart. In 1513, the Stewarts of Appin followed their royal cousin to Flodden. Was the most catastrophic Scottish military defeat since Bannockburn. The flower of Scottish nobility, including James IV himself, was killed in a September afternoon on a Northumberland hillside. The Stewart chief and his 5 sons all survived, which was remarkable. The survival rate among the Scottish nobility at Flodden was not high, and the Stewarts of Appin preserved their leadership intact when many other families were decapitated by the battle. James IV did not survive. The king who had come hunting at Castle Stalker died on the Flodden field, and the castle that bore his hunting identity, the Castle of the Hunter, the Falconer, the man who came to Appin for the game, lost the royal connection that had given it an additional layer of significance and perhaps of protection. Chapter 5. Murder, Cattle, and Donald of the Hammers, 1513 to 1607. In 1520, Sir Alexander Stewart of Invernahyle was fishing off the small island adjacent to Castle Stalker, the tiny rocky outcrop next to the Cormorant's Rock, when a party of Campbells came upon him and murdered him. His infant son, Donald, was somewhere nearby, in the castle itself, with his nurse. The Campbells, having killed Alexander, apparently left without finding or targeting the child. The nurse, understanding that the Campbells might return, hid the baby in the castle. When the danger passed, she took the child and fled to Morvern, across the water on the southern shore of Loch Laich, where she could raise him in relative safety from the Campbell threat. The child who survived this episode became one of the more memorably characterized figures in the tradition of the Stewarts of Appin. Donald grew up to be a man of exceptional physical strength, who was known as Donald nan Ord, Donald of the Hammers, because he could wield a blacksmith's hammer in each hand simultaneously. The nickname is the kind of detail that clan tradition preserves for exactly this reason. It makes the man vivid, gives him a specific physical identity, and suggests a character that was both formidable and probably alarming to those who encountered him in difficult circumstances. Donald nan Ord eventually returned to Appin and led the Stewarts in a revenge attack on Dunstaffnage Castle, where 9 Campbells were killed, in retaliation for his father's murder on the island. The violence had a specific symmetry. His father had been killed by Campbells near Castle Stalker. He killed Campbells at the Campbell stronghold, where his grandfather Sir John had been murdered. The geography of revenge in the Stewart-Campbell conflict runs through the same locations repeatedly. Donald also led the Stewarts at the Battle of Pinkie in September 1547, the last pitched battle fought between Scotland and England on Scottish soil. Pinkie was a disaster for the Scots. The English force under the Protector Somerset destroyed the Scottish army in a battle that showed what disciplined English firepower could do to Highland charges. The Stewarts of Appin fought on the losing side, as they would continue to do with some consistency. Donald nan Ord lived a long life for a man whose career was defined by physical violence. He died in 1607 and was buried on the island of Lismore, the sacred island at the mouth of Loch Laich that was the ecclesiastical centre of the region. His faithful henchman, a Carmichael, is also buried there. The image of Donald of the Hammers and his unnamed faithful companion lying together on the holy island is one of those details that makes the history of a place feel specifically local. This particular hillside, these particular people, this particular end. The period between Flodden and Donald's death in 1607 was one of continuing, grinding Stuart-Campbell conflict. Raids, counter-raids, legal disputes over land, occasional battles, and the steady pressure of Campbell expansion. The castle in the loch was the Stuarts' most secure possession through all of this, accessible only by water, difficult to assault without boats, a refuge that the Campbells could threaten but not easily take. As long as the Stuarts held the Cormorant's Rock, they held something that their enemies could not simply walk up to and take. The figure of Donald nan Ord deserves a moment's pause because he represents a specific type that recurs throughout the tradition of the West Highland clans, the extraordinarily powerful man, the man of legendary physical ability, who embodies the clan's capacity for survival and revenge in a form that is simultaneously historical and mythological. Whether Donald could genuinely wield two blacksmith's hammers simultaneously is a question that the physical mechanics of such an act make interesting to contemplate. Whether the story is literally true matters less than what it preserves. It preserves the tradition of a man who was frightening even by the standards of a community accustomed to violence, and who used that frightening quality in the service of the specific obligations, revenge for his father's murder, protection of the clan's territory, that Highland society required of its leaders. The cattle-raiding economy that killed Dugald Stewart in 1497 was not a marginal or criminal practice in the West Highlands of the period. It was a standard and expected form of economic activity, governed by its own conventions and carrying its own obligations of response. When cattle were stolen, the victims had both the right and the duty to recover them, either by taking back their own or by taking equivalent cattle from the raiders. Failure to respond to a raid was a mark of weakness that invited further raids. The raid that killed Dugald was therefore not simply a theft that went wrong, but an episode in the continuous reciprocal violence of Highland economic life. His son inherited both the cattle and the obligation to respond. The period from Flodden to Donald's death in 1607 was almost exactly a century of sustained pressure on the Stewarts of Appin from multiple directions simultaneously. Campbells from the south, Macleans from the island of Mull across the water, MacDonalds from the north and west. The castle on the Cormorant's Rock was the fixed point around which this pressure was organized and resisted. It was where the chief lived, where decisions were made, where the clan's identity was most concretely expressed. Chapter 6. The Drunken Wager. How an 8-oared wherry bought a castle, around 1620. In the history of Castle Stalker, the event that has achieved the greatest popular currency is not a battle, not a murder, and not a royal visit. It is a bet, a drunken wager between the 7th Stuart chief, Duncan Stewart, and a Campbell of Airds, sometime around 1620, in the course of a drinking session that the participants were apparently not sober enough to conduct with appropriate judgment. The castle changed hands for an 8-oared wherry. A wherry is a type of flat-bottomed rowing boat. Duncan Stewart, having drunk enough to believe that betting his castle was a good idea, staked Castle Stalker against the boat, lost, and woke up, or sobered up, to find that the Campbell had taken him at his word. Campbell held Stewart to the bet, immediately took possession of the castle and drove the Stewarts out. The specific character of this transaction, the exchange of a medieval tower house on a tidal islet in Loch Laich for a rowing boat is one of the more remarkable property transfers in Scottish history. Castle had been the seat of the Stewarts of Appin for nearly 2 centuries. It had been improved at royal expense. It had survived the Battle of Stalker, multiple raids, and the constant political pressure of Campbell expansion. It had been the home and the refuge of the family through all the violence of the 16th century. And it was lost in a card game, or whatever equivalent of a card game the 17th century Highlands had available at the point in the evening when the serious drinking began. The aftermath, at least, demonstrated that the Stuarts still had some political resources available to them even after losing their castle in a bet. Upon application to the Privy Council of Scotland, the national executive authority, the Stuarts argued that the wager had been invalid or unconscionable or made under duress or some combination of these positions. The Privy Council apparently found merit in the argument and ordered the castle returned to the Stuarts. The Campbells, unsurprisingly, did not simply hand it back. It took a long siege to finally evict the Campbells from the castle that they had won in what they presumably regarded as a perfectly valid drunken bet. The Stuart-Campbell conflict over Castle Stalker continued to oscillate. The castle changed hands between the clans multiple times across the 17th century, each transfer either the result of political calculation, military force, or the specific contingencies of the period. The structural situation was clear. The Campbells wanted the castle because it controlled a strategically important position in Loch Laich, and the Stuarts needed the castle because, without it, they had no defensible stronghold in their own territory. The tidal islet that made the castle hard to assault also made it intensely worth having, because whoever held it had something that their enemies could not simply march up and seize. The story of the drunken wager has the quality of Highland legend, the kind of story that circulates because it captures something essentially true about the people and the period, even if the specific details may have been smoothed and polished by repetition. What it captures, essentially, is the combination of stubbornness, pride, and catastrophic misjudgment that characterized clan leadership at its worst. Duncan Stewart had held the castle against all the political and military pressure that the Campbells had brought to bear on it for 2 centuries. He gave it up in an evening's drinking to a man who held him to the bet. The Privy Council appeal that eventually resulted in the castle's return to the Stuarts demonstrates that the early 17th century Highlands were not entirely outside the reach of formal law, at least when the losing party had enough connections to petition the central authority. The Stuarts were not without resources: the royal family connection, the long history of loyal service to the Scottish crown, the specific sympathies of the Privy Council toward a family that had manifestly been cheated in what was clearly an unconscionable transaction. The law gave the Stuarts something that their clan's declining military position could not: the ability to contest the Campbell occupation through institutions rather than through force alone. That a siege was then required to actually enforce the Privy Council's decision is equally revealing. The Campbells, having won the castle in a bet that the law said was invalid, did not simply hand it back because the law said they should. They had to be physically ejected, which required the Stuarts to mobilize military force, which required the Stuart clan to commit men and resources to a siege of their own ancestral stronghold. The absurdity of the situation, fighting your way back into your own castle because your chief lost it while drunk, did not escape contemporary observers, judging by the way the story has been told ever since. Chapter 7. The Glorious Revolution and the Last Stuart Occupation, 1620 to 1690. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, William of Orange's replacement of James VII on the throne of Britain, created the political situation that gave the Stuarts of Appin their last tenure of Castle Stalker. The Stuarts supported James VII, as they supported all the Stuart monarchs, with the specific combination of dynastic loyalty and Catholic or Episcopalian religious sympathy that characterized the Jacobite cause in the Highlands. The Campbells, by contrast, supported William, the Protestant Dutch prince whose claim to the throne was based on his marriage to James's daughter Mary and on the English Parliament's invitation. In 1689, the Stuarts came out for James VII. This decision was consistent with every political choice the family had made for the previous century, and it brought them back into Castle Stalker as a consequence. The castle was taken from the Campbells, and for a period the Stuarts held the Cormorant's Rock again. The period of Stuart reoccupation was brief. The Jacobite cause in Scotland in 1689 was initially centred on John Graham of Claverhouse, Viscount Dundee, who raised the Highland clans for James and won the Battle of Killiecrankie in July 1689, a stunning military victory that was immediately followed by Dundee's death in that victory, which left the Highland Jacobite rising without effective leadership. The subsequent Battle of Dunkeld in August 1689 was a government victory that effectively ended organized Jacobite military resistance in Scotland for this episode. After the defeat at Dunkeld, Castle Stalker was again forfeited to the Campbells. The Stuarts, who had held it for the brief period of Jacobite resurgence, lost it again, and the castle returned to government, which in practice meant Campbell control. The Campbells held it through the subsequent decades, maintaining it as a functional residence through the early 18th century. The political landscape of the Western Highlands in the years immediately following 1690 was one of profound adjustment. The Glorious Revolution had not merely changed the monarch, it had changed the alignment of clan loyalties in ways that the subsequent generation would have to live with. Families that had supported James VII, the Stuarts, the Camerons, the MacDonalds of Glencoe, among many others, found themselves on the losing side of a political transformation that the winners were not inclined to forget. The Campbells, who had supported William, found their already dominant position in Argyll further strengthened by the gratitude of the new government. The Glencoe Massacre of February 1692, the government-ordered killing of the MacDonald sept of Glencoe, carried out by government troops who had spent the preceding 2 weeks billeted as guests of the people they then murdered, happened not 10 miles from Castle Stalker, on the other side of the Ballachulish Narrows. The victims were a small Macaane clan of MacDonalds who had been, in the new political order, among the late submitters to the new government's authority. The massacre was planned in Edinburgh and London, and carried out by Campbell-commanded forces. The survivors of Glencoe fled across the hills in a February blizzard. Castle Stalker, garrisoned by Campbell troops in the same months, was part of the network of government strongpoints through which the new order was being enforced in the Western Highlands. The political and military context of Glencoe is different from Castle Stalker's specific history, but the proximity is not incidental. The castle in Loch Laich was part of the same contested landscape, subject to the same political forces, inhabited by the same competing clan interests that produced the Glencoe massacre. The Stuarts who had lost the castle at Dunkeld were living under the same political settlement that enabled Glencoe in the same region among the same communities. Chapter 8. The 45, Culloden, and the Castle as Government Stronghold. The Jacobite Rising of 1745, Bonnie Prince Charlie's attempt to reclaim the British throne for the Stuarts, involved the Stewarts of Appin as deeply as any clan in Scotland. The Appin Regiment, raised from the Stuarts and their allies, fought in the rising under Charles Stewart of Argyll, who led approximately 300 men from 19 different clans. At the Battle of Culloden in April 1746, the Appin Regiment suffered 92 killed and 65 wounded, casualties that, from a fighting force of that size, represent extraordinary losses. The regiment fought and died on Dromossie Moor, while, across the water at Loch Laich, their ancestral castle was in the hands of the government forces that were trying to kill them. Castle Stalker during the 45 was garrisoned by approximately 59 government soldiers under Campbell command. The castle that James IV had used as a hunting lodge, that the Stuarts had built and lost and regained and lost again, was now a link in the government's supply chain for its operations in the Western Highlands. Ships sailing between Inverary in the south and Fort William in the north called at the castle regularly, delivering men and supplies to the government forces operating in the region. The Stewarts of Appin, who had raised 300 men and marched them to Culloden, also attempted to take their ancestral castle back by military force. They brought up a siege train, small artillery, described in the tradition as 2-pound cannonballs, and attempted to reduce the castle walls. The cannonballs bounced off the walls. The castle that had been built for exactly this situation, resistant to any force that could only reach it by water, with walls thick enough to resist the artillery available to attacking parties of limited resources, held. The Jacobite Stuarts could not take their own castle back. After Culloden, the government used Castle Stalker as an administrative center for the enforcement of the post-Jacobite settlement. 6 prisoners are recorded as being held in the castle's prisoner hole for approximately a fortnight before being taken to Edinburgh for trial. The wider population of Appin was required to surrender their arms at the castle, passing in under the eyes of the government garrison to give up the weapons that might otherwise have been used to continue resistance. This is one of the more charged moments in the castle's history, the place that the Stuarts had built as their stronghold serving as the point at which their defeat and disarmament was formally administered. Charles Stewart of Argyll, who had commanded the Appin regiment at Culloden, escaped Scotland and went to Europe, where he spent the rest of his days. The forfeiture of the Stuart lands in Appin followed the Rising's defeat, and the government appointed Campbell of Glenure, Colin Roy Campbell, the Red Fox, as factor for the forfeited Stuart estates, responsible for managing them and collecting their revenues on behalf of the Crown. This appointment would have consequences that nobody, in 1746, could have predicted. The Appin regiment's losses at Culloden, 92 killed and 65 wounded from approximately 300 men, were among the heaviest suffered by any Highland unit in the battle. The regiment fought on the left flank of the Jacobite line, in the sector where the fighting was most sustained and most murderous. The men who died were the people of Appin, tenants and clansmen of the Stuart chiefs who had followed their leaders onto Dromossie Moor for the last time. Their deaths at Culloden, combined with the subsequent forfeiture of the Stuart estates and the installation of the Campbell factor, represented the most complete destruction of the clan's political and economic position since the Battle of the Pass of Brander had destroyed the MacDougalls 5 centuries earlier. The 6 Jacobite prisoners held in the castle's prisoner hole for a fortnight before being taken to Edinburgh are a small and specific detail in the large and brutal aftermath of Culloden. But they represent something important about what Castle Stalker had become. The castle built by the Stuarts, lost to the Campbells, briefly recovered, lost again, and now serving as a government garrison, was used as a holding cell for Stuart clansmen who had fought for the cause that the castle's builders would have recognized as their own. The prisoner hole, which visitors to the restored castle can see today, is a confined space below the main floor levels. The men held there for a fortnight before facing trial in Edinburgh were among the people for whom the castle had originally been built as protection. Chapter 9. The Appin Murder. The Shot That Nobody Fired. 1752. On 14th May 1752, Colin Roy Campbell of Glenure was riding along the south shore of Loch Laich near Ballachulish, on his way to carry out another round of evictions from Stuart lands when a shot rang out from the wood of Lettermore. Campbell was hit in the back and killed. He was 35 years old. The Appin murder, as it became known immediately and has been known ever since, was not merely a political assassination, though it was certainly that. It was the moment at which the accumulated pressure of the post-Culloden settlement found its most dramatic expression. The Campbell factor, who had been systematically evicting Clan Stewart tenants and replacing them with Campbell families, was shot by someone who evidently found this policy intolerable. The violation of what the Gaelic tradition called dúthchas, the principle that clan members had an inalienable right to live in their clan's territory, was the specific grievance that the shot was answering. The principal suspect was Alan Breck Stewart, a known Jacobite fugitive and a man of demonstrated willingness to use violence in the service of his convictions. He fled the area after the shooting and eventually made his way to France, where he lived out his days as a soldier in the French service. His escape meant that he could not be tried, which meant that someone else had to be. James Stewart of Glenderor, James of the Glen, was a half-brother of Argyll, the man who had commanded the Appin regiment at Culloden. He was arrested 2 days after the murder, despite the absence of any direct evidence linking him to it. His association with Jacobite fugitives, including Alan Breck Stewart, made him, in the government's assessment, a plausible accessory, or at least a convenient target. His trial was held at Inverary, in the Campbell heartland. The judge presiding was the Duke of Argyll, a Campbell. The jury was composed entirely of Campbells. The verdict was guilty. James Stewart of the Glen was hanged on the 8th of November, 1752. His body was left on a gibbet at Loch for months, in deliberate violation of the Christian obligation to give the dead decent burial, as a demonstration to the surviving Stewart community of what defiance of the government would cost. Whether James Stewart was involved in the Appin murder at all is not established by any evidence that has ever been produced. His trial was, by the standards of any impartial assessment, a judicial murder. A man convicted by a prejudiced jury in a prejudiced court of a crime for which no direct evidence of his guilt existed. Robert Louis Stevenson, who visited Appin in the 1880s and wrote about what he found there, fictionalized the murder and its aftermath in Kidnapped, published in 1886, with David Balfour and Alan Breck Stewart as its central characters. The novel is one of the most celebrated Scottish novels of the 19th century. The actual murder is still officially unsolved. The stone at Loch Laich, where James Stewart was hanged and displayed, is still there. The people of Appin know who it commemorates. The identity of the person who actually fired the shot in the wood of Lettermore has never been established, though local tradition has always had its views. The trial and execution of James of the Glen are regarded in Appin as they were regarded in 1752, as a Campbell injustice carried out on Stewart people for political reasons, using the form of law to accomplish what law was supposed to prevent. Robert Louis Stevenson visited Appin in the 1880s, more than a century after the Appin murder, and used the event as the central crime around which Kidnapped is structured. The novel, published in 1886, has David Balfour and Alan Breck Stewart as its protagonists, and the murder of Colin Campbell, the Red Fox, as the political event that drives the second half of the story. Stevenson was careful not to resolve the question of who fired the shot. His fictional Alan Breck is present at the murder, but the novel does not explicitly confirm that he did it. This is either authorial restraint or authorial accuracy, depending on your reading of both the novel and the historical evidence. The Appin murder is sometimes described as Scotland's most controversial verdict, which is competitive field. What makes it specifically controversial, rather than merely unjust, is the degree to which the injustice was systematic and deliberate, rather than accidental. The jury was chosen from 42 men, of whom 15 were named Campbell. The judge was the Duke of Argyll, chief of Clan Campbell. The trial was held in Inverary, the Campbell capital, and the political pressure on the outcome from the Hanoverian government, which wanted a demonstration that Jacobite sympathizers in the Highlands would be punished, was explicit. James Stewart was convicted because he was a Stewart in Appin in 1752, and the court was a Campbell court. Castle Stalker, visible from across the water when the weather is clear at Loch Laich, was the Campbell stronghold throughout this period. The last Campbell was born in the castle in 1775. The Campbell occupation, which had begun with a drunken bet and continued through the political convulsions of the 17th and 18th centuries, lasted until around 1800, when the family moved to their new house at Airds on the mainland. The history of Castle Stalker is, in one sense, the history of what happens when an island stronghold meets the expanding power of a more numerous and more politically connected clan. You hold it as long as you can, you lose it when you can't hold it any longer, and the loss takes many different forms across 3 centuries. Chapter 10. Roof Tax, Ruin, and the Long Silence, 1800 to 1965. The Campbells lived in Castle Stalker until approximately 1800, when they built a new house on the mainland at Airds, a couple of miles away. The move was a practical decision. A solid house on the mainland with direct road access was more convenient for a family operating in a modernizing world than a tower house on a tidal islet, accessible only by boat. But it had consequences for the castle that the move's practicality could not have anticipated. Once the Campbells left, Castle Stalker began to die. The roof came off around 1840. The tradition preserved at the castle is that the roof was deliberately removed or allowed to fall, because the absence of a roof meant the absence of a roof tax. The property rating system of the period charged rates on habitable buildings, and a roofless ruin was technically uninhabitable, and therefore untaxable. Whether the removal was this deliberate and this calculated, or whether it was simply that the roof fell in and nobody could afford or was motivated to repair it, the effect was the same. The tower that had controlled the sea lanes of Loch Laich for 4 centuries was left open to the sky. A roofless tower house in the West Highland climate is a building in rapid decline. Rain enters and soaks the masonry. Frost splits the saturated stone. Vegetation finds its way into the cracks and widens them. The floors and internal woodwork that depended on the roof for protection from the weather deteriorate and eventually collapse. By the early 20th century, Castle Stalker was in the advanced stages of this process. Structurally still standing, the 4-story basalt walls were thick enough to remain upright even without a roof, but internally a ruin. The floors gone, the upper levels exposed, the building no longer inhabitable in any reasonable sense. In 1908, the castle came back into Stewart hands when Charles Stewart of Appin purchased it from the Campbells. Charles carried out basic conservation work, preventing further deterioration without attempting the full restoration that the castle would eventually receive, and the building passed through his successors in the following decades. In 1947, Charles's successor, Duncan Stewart, who was serving as governor of Sarawak, was murdered by a Diak. The castle devolved to his widow. In 1965, Lieutenant Colonel D.R. Stewart Allward negotiated terms for the purchase of the castle from the Stewart estate. Stewart Allward was a descendant of the Stewarts. The family connection was real, though attenuated by the centuries since the 17th century ruptures. He spent the next 10 years rebuilding and restoring the castle, not by employing contractors in the conventional sense, but by doing the work himself, with his wife, his family, and friends who were willing to give up holidays and weekends to work on the restoration. This is, by any standard, an extraordinary commitment. Rebuilding a 4-story medieval tower house on a tidal islet in a Scottish sea loch without professional contractors over 10 years represents a level of personal investment that goes beyond the usual categories of heritage enthusiasm. The castle that Stewart Allward produced at the end of this decade of work is fully habitable. The floors are in, the roof is on, the windows are glazed, the rooms are furnished. It is a private home. It is also precisely because the Allward family restored it rather than a heritage agency, one of the most personal connections to a medieval Scottish castle available anywhere. Stewart Allward died suddenly while out walking on February 5, 1991. The castle has remained in family hands since his death. Access is limited. A small number of intimate, family-led guided tours during summer months, reached by boat from Port Appin by prior arrangement, which means that Castle Stalker retains, even now, the quality that has defined it since the MacDougalls first built their fortalice on the Cormorant's Rock. You can only reach it if the people there want you to. The decade of restoration that Stuart Allward undertook between 1965 and the mid-1970s was, in its specific method, unlike almost any other 20th-century castle restoration in Scotland. Most castles that have been restored, Donan, the famous example rebuilt from ruins between 1912 and 1932, were restored by professional architects and building contractors, working from surviving documentation and historical interpretation on behalf of trusts or owners with the financial resources to fund professional work. Castle Stalker was restored by a lieutenant colonel and his family and friends, spending their holidays on a tidal islet in Argyll, doing the physical work of reconstruction themselves. The consequence is a castle that feels unusually like a home rather than a heritage site. The rooms contain period furnishings that reflect the castle's history, the history of the MacDougalls and the Stewarts and the Campbells, the royal hunting visits, the clan battles and the drunken wagers and the long occupation, but they contain them in the context of a building that someone actually lives in, that is maintained as a living place, rather than preserved as a historical exhibit. The difference in atmosphere between Castle Stalker and a comparable site managed by Historic Environment Scotland is perceptible immediately on entering. This is a house that happens to be medieval, not a medieval building that has been made house-like. The approach to the castle by boat, the only approach there is when the tide is up, is itself a historical reenactment, in the sense that every person who has ever visited the castle has approached it this way. The MacDougalls came by galley. The Stewarts came by galley. James IV came by galley. The Campbells, who won the castle in a bet, presumably rowed across to take possession. The Jacobite Stewarts, who tried to retake it in 1745, would have needed boats for their siege operations. The cannonballs that bounced off the walls in 1745 were brought across the water by boat. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Allward and his family brought their building materials by boat. The connection between the place and the specific experience of arriving at it by water is unbroken across 7 centuries. Chapter 11, The Holy Grail and the Photograph. Castle Stalker in Modern Culture. Castle Stalker has 2 cultural identities in the modern world, and they are separated by about 7 centuries. The first is the castle of Clan Stewart of Appin, the hunting lodge of James IV, the site of the Battle of Stalker and the Appin murder, and all the accumulated violence and beauty of West Highland clan history. The second is Castle Argyll, from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. In the 1975 film, Castle Stalker appears in the closing sequence as the location of the French Taunter's castle, the stronghold from which the French knights hurl insults and miscellaneous farm animals at King Arthur and his companions. It is the Castle Argyll in which the Holy Grail is supposedly located. The castle appears in the film for a matter of seconds, filmed from across the water, its silhouette against the Argyll sky, providing exactly the atmospheric backdrop that the Python team required. The joke is in the contrast between the genuine dramatic quality of the setting and the absurdity of what is happening in front of it. This cameo appearance has given Castle Stalker a second life in popular consciousness that its historical identity could not have generated alone. People drive to the viewpoint on the A828 specifically to see the place where the Python film was shot. The photograph that most people take from the viewpoint, the tower rising from the water, the Morvern Hills behind it, perhaps a cormorant on the rocks in the foreground, is also, give or take, a filter and an Instagram caption, the same image that painters have been making since the Romantic tradition discovered the castle in the late 18th century. The castle appears in this image because it is one of the genuinely great Scottish castle views. The specific combination of the tidal islet, the sheltered sea loch, the background mountains, and the compact four-story tower produces a composition that seems almost designed, that reads as an idealized Scottish castle precisely because it exists at the intersection of all the qualities that such an ideal would require. It looks, from the road, exactly like what a castle in a Scottish sea loch should look like. It is also, which is rarer than it sounds, exactly what the historical reality is: the real building, in the real water, backed by the real hills. The fact that this view was chosen by a group of Cambridge and Oxford comedians in 1975 as the backdrop for a scene involving coconut shells and French insults connects the castle to a global audience that would not otherwise have known it existed. This is not a dignified connection exactly, but it is a real one. Castle Stalker is famous partly because of Monty Python and the people who come to see Castle Argyll and end up learning about the Stewarts of Appin and the Battle of Stalker and the Appin murder are people who might never have made the journey otherwise. The journey is worth making. The viewpoint on the A828 gives you the external view, the photograph. To get inside, you need to have arranged a summer tour in advance, and you need to take a boat. The boat ride is short but specific, a few minutes across the water to the islet, with the castle growing from postcard to actuality as you approach. The entrance, when you reach it, is the same entrance that Duncan Stewart's nurse carried his infant son out of after the Campbell murder on the adjacent island in 1520. The walls are the same walls that the Appin Regiment's cannonballs bounced off in 1745. The view from the battlements, across Loch Laich to Port Appin, north up Loch Laich to Glencoe, and the mountains beyond, south toward Oban and the Firth of Lorne, is the same view that James IV had when he came for the hunting. It is a view that the water keeps. From the shore, without a boat, without permission, you cannot have it. The castle remains, in this final sense, exactly what it has always been, a place that the world cannot reach unless it chooses to let you in. Chapter 12. The Cormorant's Rock, What the Castle Is, and What It Tells You. The battle cry of Clan Stewart of Appin is Creag and Scairb, the Rock of the Cormorants. It is the same name as the islet on which Castle Stalker stands. The chief's seat and the clan's war cry are the same place, the small rocky outcrop in Loch Laich that the MacDougalls first fortified around 1320, and that the Stewarts made their own after 1388, building the tower house that is still there, still inhabited, still accessible only by boat. The choice of a tidal islet as the clan's seat was a specific military and political decision, not an aesthetic one, though the aesthetics are real and have always been noticed. The West Highlands of the 15th and 16th centuries were a landscape of endemic clan warfare in which fixed land-based strongholds could be surrounded and starved out, in which mobility on water was a military advantage, and in which the ability to deny access to your residence was more valuable than the ability to sally out and fight. Castle Stalker's position gave the Stewarts exactly this: a stronghold that could not be besieged by land, that required boats and planning to attack, that could be resupplied from the sea while a land-based force sat helplessly on the shore. The castle has been besieged twice in its recorded history. The Campbell siege after the drunken wager of 1620, evicting a garrison that Campbell held the castle by right of a bet, was resolved eventually in the Campbells' favour. The Jacobite Stewart siege of 1745, 300 men with 2-pound cannon, failed, the cannonballs bouncing harmlessly off walls that had been built to resist exactly this. In neither case was the castle taken by assault. It was lost by wager, lost by forfeiture, abandoned from convenience, but never by direct military action. The castle's physical character reflects this history. The walls are thick not for show, but because they needed to resist whatever force an attacker could bring up in small boats. The entrance at ground level was the point of maximum vulnerability. The the one place where the water defense was breached by the access requirement, and it was therefore the most heavily protected. The upper floors gave visibility over the surrounding loch in all directions, so that an approaching force could be identified while still far enough away that a defense could be prepared. The building is a specific tactical response to a specific tactical problem, which is what medieval military architecture is always supposed to be. The accumulated history of Castle Stalker is the history of Clan Stewart of Appin compressed into a single location. The MacDougall origins and the Bruce victory, the Stewart acquisition and the royal hunting visits, the Battle of Stalker and the murders and the cattle raids, the drunken wager and the long Stewart-Campbell oscillation, the Jacobite loyalty and the Culloden losses, the Appin murder and its aftermath, the roof tax and the long silence, the decade of personal restoration. All of this happened in and around a 4-story tower house on a tidal islet in a sea loch in Argyll, visible from the road if you know where to look, reachable by boat if the family wants you there. The cormorant is still on the rock. It still spreads its wings to dry. The tide still comes and goes. The view from Port Appin shore is still the same view that has been making painters stop and open their sketchbooks since the Romantic tradition discovered the Western Highlands. The Morvern Hills are still behind the castle, purple or gray depending on the light. The water of Loch Laich is still between you and the Cormorant's Rock, and if you want to reach it, you need a boat.